Okay, everybody. Thank you all for coming in tonight. This is the John Youssi panel at the Music City Multicon. I'm Brent Griffith with the Broken Token Classic Gaming podcast, and I'm fortunate enough to be here with John to talk about his illustrious career. And John, I think we're going to cover a lot of pinball, and I'd like to touch on, well, first of all, a round of applause for John. Thank you for coming out, John. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
So we're going to cover about 7,000 slides through all of John's career.
You removed some.
Well, we cut it down to about 6,700. I know, John, I wanted to ask real quick. I know you've done a lot of stuff outside of pinball. Can you touch on that for a minute? Some product stuff, some things I know everyone here is going to recognize.
Well, in art school, my senior year, I did a senior thesis illustrating a book on rock and roll lyrics, just really smart thing to do, right? But I knew there was a record company in Chicago, and I figured I could get a job there doing album covers,
Don't be afraid of the mic.
Okay. Okay. And so I got out of school and went over there, and there was basically 3 artists working there, and they didn't need any more. So I drove a cab at night for 3 months and got a job as an apprentice. And then that artist, the one artist who was on the bubble, kind of married a rock star, Evie Sands, and went to Hollywood. And they called me, and so I did album covers for 5 or 6 years. And ultimately, that's important because later on, when I got into pinball, I was a little bit afraid to do pinball, but I thought, well, a pinball back glass is it's not the same size, but it's like an album cover, And I'd done maybe a couple hundred album covers. So that's what I did, and later on started my own business doing advertising, book covers, magazines. Even did some advertising illustrations for Stern Pinball back then, like a pinball machine in space, like a space station for Stern. Did a couple of those, but that's how I got started. And then how I got into pinball, I had worked on a game called Old Chicago with Dave Christensen at Bally, a legendary artist. And I kind of bombed on it. It was back in the silkscreen days, so I couldn't do my airbrush thing, and lost money on it. So I thought, never again. I'm done with pinball. And about, in '88, I had a good career going, doing advertising art and everything, and I was real straight. I did a lot of food product advertising for United Airlines, McDonald's, real straight stuff. And a friend of mine called. He was Evel Knievel's business manager, Fred Bezark, and he knew the guys at Williams, and they got stuck in a jam where they needed an artist. Python Angelo had worked. I don't know if you know Python Angelo. When you're an advertising artist, you don't work with people named Python. But Fred was telling me that they needed an artist to finish a game that he had started, and this game called Jokers was ready to be manufactured, and they had no artwork. So I met with Fred, and I had excuses going in there because I didn't want to get bogged down like I did on Old Chicago and lose money. And so I'm sitting across the desk from him. I think he was the president of Williams at the time. And he's giving me the pitch. And then he said, so how much do you think you would charge to paint a back glass for us? And I thought, here's how I get out of here. I'll quote a price so high, he'll say he can't afford it, and I'm out the door. And I did quote that price, and he wrote the number down on a piece of paper, and he slid across, and he says, you're not charging enough. How about this? And I did my brain, I'm not kidding, just did a 180, and I'm a pinball artist. I've been one ever since, kind of tiptoed into it. And I'm not kidding, an hour later, not even that, probably 20 minutes later, I'm in Python Angelo's office meeting with him because he art directed me on that first back glass Jokers. And that was, I think, '88. I'm not certain.
Well, John, that brings a lot of questions to mind. But
yeah,
I'm going to actually make a note, and we're going to set that aside because I want to get into your slide deck and talk about John and I have discussed a little earlier. I think you're going to spotlight some games, and through those games, you're going to teach us about your career and what it means to be a pinball artist. Is it fair?
Sure.
Okay. So let's get into the first slide. John, would it be helpful if I turned one of these monitors for you to help direct?
I'll just
Okay,
watch the
sure,
display here. That's easier for me. I just want you to know how far back I go. I'm from a little town in Ohio, New Philadelphia, and we had a great park, Tuscarora Park, and they had an arcade there, a penny arcade basically, and there were a lot of games there, fortune games, fortune teller games, shooting games, etc. And you could go down there and spend half a day there, But guess what? No pinball. This was probably in the late 50s. And later on, of course, Roger Sharp. I don't know if you're in the industry or you played pinball for a while, you know that he got that changed in New York City. And so that's my first experience without pinball. Later on, I saw one visiting one of a cousins in DeKalb, Illinois, and that's where I saw my first pinball machine. I was probably 12, 13 years old, and the laws had been changed, and it was in a drugstore or something. And I remember just thinking, it's evil. It's evil, but I don't know what's evil about it, but it's evil. Had to be evil. It was illegal, for a while. Yeah, go ahead. And I'm traditionally trained, went to art school in Chicago, and loved traditional paint as growing up. I mean, that's all I could do. I had horrible grades in school, so I loved art. Every pair of blue jeans I owned back then was coated in paint. From airbrushing is really messy, and I didn't mind it. I liked it, It's kind of like when you open that first box of Crayolas and you smell it at the first day of school, and you go, "Ooh, that's nice," That was my comfort zone. You can go ahead. So ultimately, I end up working digitally as kind of forced. You can go on to the next slide too. I'm just kind of describing the old days when I loved it. A good example here is, I'm kind of jumping forward a few years, but we had finished Twilight Zone, and I can't remember the exact story, but they hadn't started manufacturing it yet, so it didn't exist. And nowadays, we would have a full machine render that a 3D artist would have put together for us, But back then, I had to paint the whole game from scratch, which was fine with me because they paid me to do that, And I think they were giving one away on the Today Show or something, and they needed a photo of it. So I did that with a couple of my games for the same same reason.
John, would you also do the artwork for the flyers and all the marketing
No,
material?
there was an advertising agency in Chicago that handled that, and I don't remember their name.
Next slide.
Next slide. Yeah, sorry, I forgot that.
Oh, that's all right.
Forgot that part. Just some eye candy. I was a fan of Gil Elvgren, a pinup artist, and I was able to, when I worked on Jackbot, that's what that's from. You can go ahead to the next slide. I just have some we can go through here just for viewing purposes. Anybody know what game this is from?
Roadshow.
That's right, Roadshow. By the way, Pat Lawler, a game designer that I worked with, the first full game I did, Whirlwind, was a Pat game, and Pat had done Earthshaker and Whirlwind, and he loved disaster themes, which explains Dialed In later on, Next slide. Yes. These are the tools of the trade, airbrushes, and my dad gave me one when I was like a sophomore in high school or something, but he gave me no compressor, so it just sat in a drawer for like 6 years. And like my junior year in art school, I cranked it out, and I started playing with the airbrush, and like psychedelic stuff, eyeballs, with feather tears and stuff. I took the first airbrush illustrations and to show my teachers at Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. They had no clue how it was done. They thought it was charcoal or something. But I embraced it, and when I worked at Album Graphics, I was not only an illustrator, but I was a designer, and we hired like the best artists, the best illustrators in the country, even in the world. And those guys were patient, I remember Dave Willardson and Charlie White III, they were like airbrush gods. And one of them did a Jerry Lee Lewis album cover for us, and, I had a million questions and they answered them, So it's kind of like going to grad school.
So, John, you mentioned that your father had bought that airbrush.
It was a Pache airbrush made in Chicago, just a few blocks from where I later worked.
So I'm familiar with that brand. They're still around,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm familiar with it from modeling.
Oh,
So
right.
either small plastic modeling, cars, diorama scenes, and even in the RC world, they're kind of the upper end way to paint bodies. So
Sure.
what was the impetus for the were you and your dad modeler? Was
No,
there
my dad was like a corporate manufacturing vice president. But
okay?
before the war, he had gone to art school, the same school I ended up going to in Chicago. And the war broke out. He ended up managing a plant. Thank you.
Oh yes, sir.
Thank you, Brent. Anyway, he ended up managing a factory and doing a lot better than most artists, by the way. So anyway, he gave me that Pache, and like I say, it really did sit in a drawer for a long time. The on the top row there, the second one in from the left side is a Pache AB, I think it's called, and that thing it's got an oscillating needle that goes back and forth. It just sounds like a dentist drilling away on you. You know, it's creepy to use, but I learned from Dave Willardson, one of those great artists, great illustrators. He did all the Fender guitar commercial or illustrations that were in Rolling Stone magazine. And he said, you can draw a strand of hair with that airbrush, And so Album Graphics bought me one. And next slide. And I think it's worth mentioning that that's where all my airbrushes are now, up in a box on a closet. They haven't been touched since like 2001, I think. And they really are still in there. My son in Vancouver, he's a big fan of Masters of the Universe and buys figures and paints them, so he's got a few of them now. My son, Andy. Yeah, next slide. Thank you, Brent. These are my tubes of gouache paint. They're now a lamp. And if you go to buy them, like back when I bought them, some of the price tags are on them, they're like $8. Now it's like $30 for a tube of cobalt blue, It's crazy. I still paint. I paint in oils. Just like I did as a kid, I paint landscapes, and I study portrait painting, traditional classic portrait painting, but not with gouache. Gouache it's a great color for pinball because I painted in acrylics because I was told your art will be valuable someday, and it's really true. So I painted in acrylics because most of my album covers were painted in dyes, and it's not light fast. Acrylics and this gouache is light fast, and my originals from back then look the same as they were finished, like back in the 70s or 80s or 90s. And gouache had it way over acrylics because if you need a really rich dark blue or rich red or green or anything, gouache is great, but it's water soluble, and you can't touch it or scratch it. It's very fragile, but you got to have it if you're a pinball artist. You got to have it.
So is this lamp displayed prominently in your home to this day?
Yeah, that's in my studio.
That's in your studio.
Yeah, and then behind it there, that copier is where my Willy Wonka machine is now. Soon to have a Toy Story. Yeah, next slide. Okay, I'm just doing Addams Family first. These aren't really in chronological order, but this is pre-digital, and everybody knows this game. There's a ton of them out there. I'm very proud of this game. And it was fun. And I have a little story to go along with it. A lot of times we'd build prototypes. So Pat Lawler, the designer, had an idea to illuminate windows in the back glass. It's not the first time it had been done, but we pitched this and we ended up doing it. Also, the topper was, I talk things over with Pat at the beginning. He gets super excited about a theme. And I can talk more about this when we do Twilight Zone too, but when you work for a pinball company, and I was never an employee, I was a contractor, but you're paid, but you also get royalties. So if you have a great idea for a game and it could sell a lot, it's top secret. It's like you're developing a new weapon or something. So I'd be working on someone else's game, and he'd call me into his room and he'd go, shh. He'd lock the door and he'd say, what would you feel about doing an Addams Family game? Do you think that's a good theme? And his eyes would be bursting. By the way, his office, there were just parts all over. You couldn't sit down. There would be electronic parts everywhere. So I usually stood and had a conversation with him. Go ahead, next slide.
So I want to ask a question about this, and I think we'll get into this a little later when we're talking about, to a degree, when we're talking about having everything signed off by
Yes.
the various strata of individuals that have to sign off. So I'll just throw it out here instead of asking a leading question. Tell us the story behind the little cloud generator graphics. So I would assume that at some point before the movie came out, you all had to see some rough cut of the movie.
We were given 35 millimeter slides, and that's all we had. They didn't want us to see the movie. We didn't see any clips. It was secret, but there was enough to go there. There were also some printed poster material that would be in theaters, for previews and such. So we had that. There was actually quite a bit of material, which is good.
Oh, so I didn't even realize that you didn't even get the movie to try to get
No.
the storyline or
Right.
anything to that
I
effect.
mean, nowadays we get them at the last minute. You sign your life away, by the way, when you get that. That's all super secret too. And if you leak it, a good example is in Chicago, there was a company called Tiger Electronics. And they got, when Star Wars came back in the late 90s or whenever it was, they had the license to build, I don't know if it was a watch or some toy, and one of their artists leaked some information. And this is $1 million contract. Boom, gone, taken away from them because of one artist, let the cat out of the bag.
Wow.
So it's serious.
So how often, like with the little cloud generators, which are the things in the upper right-hand corner there, I know they're in the graphics and on the play field, you can see them. They look like, I guess, little horns that in the movie, as I understood, they were actually supposed to generate clouds, but they cut all that from the movie.
I was going to say, you know more about that than I do.
I mean, I'm assuming you all get to a point where you have to make a best guess at what goes in the game because of what you have, the assets given to you.
I can tell this was into it a ways because the figures are worked out and the mansion's worked out in the back glass. And the back glass was probably the third thing you worked on. I always did the cabinet first, then start on the play field. And then when there was time, I worked on the back glass. So this is probably halfway in. And we may have gotten more information by then too. And this is a long time ago.
Oh, yes, sir. So next slide.
Just a good example of, this is playfield art all here. Done the old-fashioned way. Playfields were silk screened. They weren't painted. They were inked. And then a screen cutter a lot of you probably don't know about silk screen, but you had to screen each color individually, laying that color down in a screen shop. And with Adam's Family, that's the best-selling game of all time. We built 22,000 of them. And if you're printing 22,000 playfields, silk screening with like 12 or 14 colors, and those colors have to be laid down one at a time and then air dried. And every screen shop in Chicago this is what I've been told by Greg Ferris, the art director, every screen shop in Chicago was working on Adam's Family playfields or plastics, and they had big racks out in the alley, out back drying them. And it went on a long time. And I'm kicking myself because I knew what was going on, and I never went down there to see it. But it's a pretty interesting story. So I can say one more thing about this, and we'll get into it later, but there's a lot of steps that go into doing any of this artwork. It goes through like a concept. Oh, come to think of it, I'll tell you that later because otherwise I'm getting ahead of myself. Go ahead. These are playfield sketches, and by this point, that sketch on the left is a rough sketch that I would have done on Mylar, and I probably did several sketches before that. Maybe pieces of the playfield. Playfields were constantly changing. The right one is a tight sketch. So once everything has been approved locally at Williams, this is a Williams or Bally game, we would hire Kevin O'Connor, a legendary pinball artist who's done like 80 games, inked almost all my games. And so that is a tight pencil sketch on the right that he would get. I wanted him to know exactly where the ink went. So the pencil almost looks like ink, but he had really good control. As he can ink like one of these animators outside here. Next slide. Another sketch detail of the center of the play field. I call that part of the play field the heart of the play field. It's above the flippers, and I have a method of doing play fields because I realized right away, otherwise you have a migraine for like months. So I try to tiptoe into it and solve some problems early, but once I have the answer for the heart of the play field, I relax, because the rest of it just kind of flows off of that. Next one. These are the photographs of the ink. I have all this artwork. I just laid them on my studio floor and shot them, but just some of them are detail shots. Again, inked by Kevin O'Connor, who I saw at Pinball Expo last week. Next slide. Okay, this is a color comp. So I've done the sketch, Kevin has inked it, and sometimes while he's inking it, I'll do the color comp, which is a guide for the person. Someone's got to cut silk screens, which are like stencils. So you can count the colors over there on the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 colors. That's okay. Like when I first started, I was a rookie, and most other artists use 10 colors, but I'd use like up to 15, I think, once on a game. And you can combine colors to, like, you could use yellow and do a screen, or a half tone of blue over that to make green. So some of those colors on the right. So that's an indication of the colors we have for my screen cutter, Margaret Hudson, who's also a pinball artist from the Bally days. But we'd meet and go over this, and she'd cut 12 screens, a laborious job.
So when you were at this stage, is the playfield approved and locked in, or is there a possibility for changes even now?
Not at this point. Not at this point. And by the way, there were a lot less playfields submitted. Later on, you'll see just a screen grab of my playfield browser and going through a lot of versions just in a month. But because it's once you do those rough sketches at the beginning, but once you're here, you're locked in. And every now and then there's a change, but it's expensive to make a change.
So you mentioned all the shops that were running screens for the game. Is Margaret or someone like her producing, I assume, screens for all these shops?
Well, you only do one set of screens, and then you cut them out of Ruby Lith, and then they do a film version. So you can duplicate those screens.
Gotcha.
So the screen, the film is black and white no matter the color. So it's a film process that you're getting over that was not my job.
Yes.
That's my answer. That was not my job.
There was one that she produced, and then that was copyable from that point.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Through a photographic process. This kind of leads me to my next story, and this is the tight sketch of the back glass. And I have the tight sketch, and the next slide, you don't have to show it yet, but it's a color comp of the back glass, and then the final artwork would be done. But almost each one of those actors had a right to reject things. So you got Raul Julia, Angelica Houston, Christopher Lloyd, Christina Ritchie. I don't know who Pugsley was, and I can't remember who Lurch was.
Yeah,
but so they all had to prove it. So first, I got to like it. Then Pat Lawler's got to like it. Then the bigwigs at Williams have to like it. Then they have to like it. And that was a Sony picture, as I recall. So they had, that was Paramount. So they had to like it. And I got through everybody except for Angelica Houston. And she kept saying, I need narrower hips. You got to make my hips narrower, And I don't blame her, I took fashion illustration in school, and you always stretch the female form out, So I made the change 3 times, and you can go on to the next one now, by the way. And we were down to the stage where I had done the final painting, and they were ready to build games. It's kind of like that game with Python with Jokers. They were ready to build Addams Family. The other game on the floor was coming off. And they were starting to build this game, and we didn't have an approval from her. So Ken Fidesna, the same guy that hired me, called me, and he said, John, she made one more change, said, make my hips thinner, so the painting's all done. He said, I want you to get on a plane. I want you to go out to Hollywood. We got your room booked at the Beverly Wilshire, and don't come home until she accepts it. And I thought, throw me in that briar patch, I'll do that, you know. And by the way, the Hollywood premiere was that weekend. So it was Pat Lawler, Larry DeMar, Roger Sharp, and myself. We went out, and I had made the changes, you know, that she requested when we got there. So the artwork went to her people, and while she was reviewing it, we all got a tour of the Star Trek Next Generation set at Paramount VIP tour. So it just gets better, you know. It just gets, pinball is so good to me, man, I'll tell you.
So, and you painted this. Was this was airbrushed?
Say that
Was
again?
it airbrushed? Airbrushed work?
This is a color comp. So by the time, before I start painting, I want all the questions resolved. So when I'm painting, I'm relaxed. You know, everything's solved. You know the colors and everything. It's important with airbrush because you don't want to get too much paint down. So that's a color comp. It's, you know, colored with magic markers, pencil, and airbrush right there. And Pat Lawler has the final artwork. I don't have a good image of the final painting that was sent out there.
So when you're going in to make those requested changes, so for example, let's just say that the hand model for Thing didn't like the way his thumb was, and you had to make a change to Thing's thumb. Would you have to reproduce this, or are you able to?
Well, I got really good at airbrushing. I got really good at it. And so at the beginning, you're always terrified something's going to go wrong. But I treated my paintings like surgical sites. So if I was working on Thing, the whole painting would be covered with tissue, and I just cut a little window in there like I'm doing surgery, you know. And I'd work in that area, and the other area was protected, you know. And if something went wrong, I'd repaired everything. I'd had everything possible happen to a painting, you know. So by the time I did the final painting, I was relaxed, but I was also exhausted because the deadline was so tight. I wanted to say one more thing about when we went out there to Paramount. She looked at it, and you can go back one. Angelica Houston, and I never met her personally, even at the premiere. I was standing next to her, but never introduced to her. But she said, "This is great, but could you take your teeniest brush and just remove a little bit of my left nostril?" So I had a studio out there. I flew all my stuff out there, compressed air and airbrushes and stuff, you know, and I just got my smallest Winsor Newton number 7 sable-haired brush, you know, cut a little window in the tissue and just went, approved. So that was awesome. Next slide.
If it was 2022, she probably asked you to make her hips wider.
I don't know. I didn't worry about that. I just on to the next thing. She approved it. This is just plastic sheets. They're silk screened, the same method, you know. So we had 22,000 plastic sheets. They're all grouped together. Sometimes we do 2 sets on a sheet of plastic, you know, depending. But this is a color comp that would be used by the screen cutter. Next slide. By the way, the plastics I'm referring to, we'd also call them butyrates that cover up switches and things like that. There are a lot of plastic parts on a game, but those are the flat pieces that are die cut out, and you see on top of switches and all over the place. I'm going to go through this as fast as I can. When I received the game, originally the first games, the designers would work on an old drafting table. Everything would be in pencil. But by now here, this is Roadshow. So they were using CAD programs. So that's Pat Lawler's CAD program, or his CAD drawing over on the left. And we had a method for registering all of our artwork that went over that, so that in the end, there's no tolerance for error, because quality was a big deal. So all of my artwork, all my sketches, all my color renderings to prepare for Margaret, you know, they were all like, what do they call that? They had like a little round pinhole thing that would you tape down, and every other piece of artwork that comes along after that would have maybe 6 registration marks where they would fall right into place. The next photo in the middle is a whitewood. And so I'd go down there, you know, I'm doing it right now. I'm working on a Steve Ritchie game, and I was there last week photographing the whitewood to help me visualize it better, you know, and see underneath things. You can see the 2 talking heads up there, Red and Ted. Again, these aren't in chronological order. Funhouse was the first game with a talking head. Over on the right is another color comp for the screen cutter. Next slide. Same thing with Whitewater with designer Dennis Nordman. I think there's more colors on this one. This was a perspective problem for me because we wanted the Grand Canyon flowing down the middle of the play field. And one thing I learned from Python, he could make the play field look like it had depth, like you could reach down into it. So I really wanted to draw those canyons like you could get down into them and kind of fool the eye with perspective. Next slide. So Funhouse originally was called Crazy House. You can go to the next slide now, Brent. Thank you. Crazy House was the working title, and later on the lawyers found out there was someone already owned that title. So we couldn't do that. Next slide. And here's a couple other ones that I pitched. Just sideshow. I don't remember what happened to that one. But these are, I'm not just drawing them to do I'm really solving the logo problems, but I'm also pitching possible ideas for it. Next slide. For all artwork as an illustrator, for everything I do and still do, you have to have the concept first, which can be a verbal agreement between a game designer and me or an art director, followed by thumbnail sketches and the idea. You can go, well, I'll leave that there. In art school, one of the things I learned in illustration class was to do fast thumbnail sketches. And that avoids you going down the wrong trail too far, putting a lot of time into something. So we were told to do 10 thumbnails in like 10 minutes. And if you need to do more, you do more. But after you do 10, you find 2 you like, and you work on those, and you keep refining it and building more and more. So those are the thumbnails. Then I would do a rough sketch, layers of tissue paper. I start with a light blue, non-photo blue Prismacolor pencil, and then just get darker pencil, working on layers and layers and layers. And then the tight sketch would be rendered in graphite on vellum, followed by the color comp. By then, all the problems are solved, everybody's approved it, and I began the final art. And that's for everything: cabinets, playfield, plastics, you name it, back glasses. Next slide. For other artists around here, they know this story, about all those versions. This is a Funhouse color sketch. You can go on to the next one. When I was asked to do Funhouse, it was the same secret thing, but if you know Funhouse, it's about a talking dummy, a talking mannequins dummy. And I remember one of my first meetings, I went into Larry DeMar's office, and Pat was there, Larry DeMar, and our mechanical engineer, John Crutch, who had a working talking head. It was just mechanical, like a robot. And when I came out of that meeting, Python's office was next door. And Youssi, come in here, I want to talk to you. And he called me Magooch, because he's from Transylvania. Python is really from Transylvania. Pulls me into his office. Don't do that game with Lawler. No one will buy a game that insults you, because Rudy would insult you to call you names and such, And I never fell for that one, But at the beginning of the game, because you have so much real estate to fill, there's just so much that you start right away just making a list of, like in this case, amusement park, carnivals, sideshow characters. Just grab as much stuff at the beginning, and I would refer to that through the whole game, because you hit dead ends sometimes. So I'm trying to develop, these are thumbnails, and at least the one on the right is a thumbnail, and there's some more coming up here.
So is this your writing here on the left where you were, I guess, brainstorming features of a fun house?
Exactly. Yeah, I still do it,
Collapsing stairs, slides.
Yeah, in one of our first meetings, Williams was on California Street or Avenue, whatever it's called, right near Addison. And the Chicago River ran behind it. And on the other side of the Chicago River was Riverview Amusement Park, right? I've never been there because I lived in Ohio at the time, and it was gone by the time I was working there. But everybody from Chicago just about did Riverview. And they had a fun house there, and I was told about a lot of the gags. There's a book on Riverview. I bought the book. So I had to bone up on all that stuff. And I incorporated a lot of Riverview things in it. There was an Aladdin's Castle. Go ahead. But Pat had told me about Rudy, the mannequin, the talking head, and he wanted him a little demented, a little out there, you know. So it really is a funny, mad, crazy house, in addition to a fun house. So I didn't know how demented to make it. So I did these thumbnails. I was at a press run up at Serigraph in West Bend, Wisconsin. And this is pre-digital printing. So when you make changes on a press, the pressmen have to go in and make changes. It takes a long time. So I go out to my truck and I was brainstorming sketches here, just rough sketches on a legal pad, ideas. And one of those I had Rudy's driving like a carnival truck. And like on the belly of the trailer in the back, there's like bars where he's captured victims from previous funhouse visits. And that was a step too far. I went too far with that. Another one, he's driving the truck, like the Carney truck, and there's like a convertible next to him at a light or something with a hot girl in it, you know, and he's coming on to her. That was not acceptable. But it was fun to work on. Next slide.
That's all part of the approval process and adjusting the design I take.
And you can see I didn't spend a lot of time on it. I didn't use any anatomy, real anatomy. It's just getting images down. I'd fax these to Pat. This is before email or anything. And boy, you better have the latest, greatest fax machine too. It was a big deal. So he'd get a fax and he could read it. A lot of people can't read or understand what I'm thinking, but he knew exactly what I was thinking. Yeah, next slide. So now we're getting close. I saw Rudy as kind of like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, and that went by the wayside. That's the sketch in the upper right. The one in the lower center, Rudy's being kicked out of town because it's doing something evil. Whatever. And the one in the upper left is the one Pat liked. Again, these sketches are probably all done in one day. Go ahead. So I had approval for that, the one in the upper left where Rudy's got a cane and Pat wanted him pointing at the sign, Funhouse, you know, big carnival sign. And so now I take, like a lot of the cartoonists out there, draw right out of their head. I mean, if I'm going to do that, he's going to look like a cartoon, you know. I wanted to have some real quality. So I always worked from photos if I could. And that's me with my son, Charlie, who's now 36 years old. And my wife, Jenny, is on the right there. It doesn't really look like her. And so I'm just developing parts of the back glass separately. I probably already had a pretty good idea what the rest of it is. You can go on to the next slide.
So did your wife and son have approval and denial rights?
If they wanted to eat, they did. They were always involved in this stuff. This is just a fun part of pinball because I was in my 40s before I ever started doing pinball. I think I was turned 40 when I did that first game. And I remember that golf cart in the upper left is from No Good Gophers. And I remember I was drawing that. I'd been Sunday night, like 10:30 at night. And I was just drawing stupid golf carts, you know, they weren't fun. And I remember thinking, you dummy, you almost got kicked out of high school for doing this kind of stuff, you know? I had a comic book at the Catholic school where that featured that the bad person was our homeroom nun, Sister Eusebia. And someone got caught, you know, me. And I didn't get expelled, but it came close because I said enough about that. Just keep going. I survived that. Just a close-up of the final art of Rudy. Next slide.
Did Rudy's look evolve from those rough thumbnail sketches, or?
Well, yeah, two things. The mechanical engineer, John Crutch, he gave me mechanical drawings of the mechanism. So I put tissue over that and just started drawing heads. And this is a square cube. It is basically what it is, a big cube. And so his head couldn't have like a narrow chin or anything like that, you know. And the ears were a problem, you know. definitely. And the paint, or his hair is just painted on. So that the shape of the mechanism really had a lot to do with that. Plus, Pat, at the very beginning, he said, watch a movie called Magic with Anthony Hopkins, I think, starred in that. He had a ventriloquist dummy that was evil. And then we had, like, my kids had every toy imaginable. They were really spoiled, So they had their own dummies. So I grabbed my Jerry Mahoney dummy out, and we had a Groucho dummy, or mannequin's dummy, so I just reviewed those. Next slide. And that's the final artwork. Final painting that's hanging on the wall in my studio. I won't sell that painting because it's got too much family in it. My son Andy, my older son, he's next to the ticket counter there counting his money because he's trying to figure out if he's got enough to get in the fun house. A lot of these gags, like that, there's two doors, well, one door leading into the fun house on the left and one coming out. And at the Riverview Funhouse, it's the same configuration. And at the entrance to the door, there is a grate where there would be a fan in there that would blow up. And the guy running behind the scenes, running the fun house, when a girl walked up with a skirt, he'd push the button. That's real. That really was I didn't have to make anything up about that. I have a gag in there on the left about wild boy raised by suburban coyotes, because I lived way out in the country, and I've moved as far away from Chicago as I could get, man. But we had coyotes out there, and no one believed me, so it became a thing, everybody would laugh at me. But so that's why I put that in there. Now there's coyotes everywhere. Twilight Zone is my favorite artwork to work on, and you can go to the next slide. And it began kind of the same way with Pat. I was down working on someone else's game, and I remember getting called into his office, and he's bug-eyed, pop-eyed. And he says, again, there's no place to sit because there's ramps and parts and switches all over the place. And he says, what would you say if I said we could get the Twilight Zone license? And he's whispering so no one hears, And I said,
was Pat's office bugged? Did he suspect that it was bugged?
Everybody was that way.
It was just that
because we
covert.
wanted to, if you had a better idea than everybody else, your game would sell more. We'd all get more royalties, So on Adam's Family, that was a big deal when you sell 22,000 games, I don't remember how many of these were sold, but so everybody was secretive out there if they had a new mechanism or something, or a new idea. And there were new ideas. Everybody was coming out with stuff. The deal here was I was working on another game, but Pat said, we have approval from Viacom. I think that was Viacom. But we had to get Carol Sterling. Rod Sterling had died of cancer like a few years before. And so we had to go to his estate, his widow, Carol Sterling. So she had to buy into it. She wasn't sure she wanted her husband on a pinball machine. So I remember I had like a long weekend to do, not that sketch, you can go to the next one, to do a fast sketch. And I just remember going out right away, buying a book called The Twilight Zone Companion. And I had a little black and white TV in my studio, and Twilight Zone was running on a UHF channel, channel 32 in Chicago, something like that. So I'd shoot with my 35 millimeter camera with a really slow shutter speed because it flickers. Those old TVs flickered. So a lot of the pictures had lines going across them, but every third picture would be a good one. And that's how I did that fast, especially at the beginning. Rod Sterling has a really weird mouth. I shouldn't say it's weird, it's just very distinctive. So I wanted to capture that. Pat had, I don't think I did that in a long weekend, just looking at it, but it was fast. It was really fast. He wanted a gumball machine in it. I think that's the only thing that's not in an episode, maybe the pyramid with the eye. But everything else is from an episode of The Twilight Zone. And the pinball, by the way, is obviously, I don't think there's a pinball episode. Oh, there is a pinball machine, I think, in the background in one, maybe in a diner or something. But it was just a ton of fun to work on. You can go to the next slide. So this is that same sketch. It went to Carol Sterling. She liked it. She said, my husband, the cigarette smoking contributed to his demise, lose the cigarette. Everything else is just great. And we told her, well, in pinball, you can sneak things in. So we asked her to, if she had any personal messages or anything. So there's a stack of books underneath that table on the left. And I don't recall the little messages from her, but there are like kids' initials, you know, family and such like that on those books. Next slide. Oh, hold on a second. Those notes around there are just feedback from the team, maybe from Carol Serling. Okay, you can go on to the next one. Onto the play field, a white wood on the left. You can see the gumball machine up on top. That's just a photo that when I go down there, I'd photograph the play field from straight up so I just know what was going on. And the final play field on the right. Next slide. This is Pat Lawler back then, and that's the working white wood. This was in probably Larry DeMar's office, and it's in a Adams Family cabinet. Next, go ahead.
So I was looking for a pin, which I have summarily lost. Those that know me won't find that odd, even though I just had it. I'll go ahead and ask now. It's okay. I'll ask now instead of making a note and trying to work it in later. You mentioned royalties.
Your pen is by your leg.
Right under your right
There
leg.
by the yellow cord.
Those that know me will also realize that I put things in places so I won't lose them or forget where they're at. This was a perfect example that is now going to be on YouTube forever of that.
I'll tell you,
that
that doesn't get any better.
No.
That's why my glasses have
Let me
this on
back
it.
up a little bit here. So you mentioned royalties in kind of the secrecy of that's the first I've ever heard of that in all of the folks in the pinball industry that I've had the opportunity to speak with.
I'll tell you how important that was. My first full game was Whirlwind. And I remember I got paid for it, you know. I got paid for the game. And I don't remember what it was, but about a month later, another check came in the mail, and I looked at it, and I go, they paid me, well, it wasn't really twice, but it was the cost of painting a back glass, a lot of money. And I said, they paid me twice, you know? And so Jenny brought it down to me. I went down to my studio, and I had an envelope out. I was addressing the envelope to send the check back to Williams, saying you paid me twice for something, you know? And then down in the little corner of the check, it said royalties, Whirlwind, you know? And the thing was, I got royalties for greeting cards, for Bradford Exchange plates, things like that. I did a lot of greeting cards. And they were like, you might get a check for $15. This was for thousands, you know? And I go, oh, by the way, I went and looked at my contract right away. And I go, oh my God, they sold a lot of games, you know? It was a big deal it was like getting paid for nothing almost, you know? Because I think they sold 4,000 of those games.
I hit the mouse. Sorry.
Say what?
I hit the mouse pad.
You're forgiven.
Transitioned.
You're forgiven.
Thank you.
So when we finished the game, we'd build prototypes, and maybe 4 or 5, 6 prototypes, and they go out on test. So the team, not me, the team could figure out if it was too easy, too hard. They'd move posts, things like that, to really dial it in and get it shooting smooth, not too easy, not too hard. So this was I think this was at a bar out in Woodstock, Illinois. And that's Pat Lawler in the upper left, myself there, Scott Slomiani on the right, Larry DeMar on the lower left, and Ted Estes on the right. And Ted, Pat, and me were all working at Jersey Jack till Pat retired a few months ago. Scott might be working there too, as a matter of fact. I'm not certain. Next slide. Those were always fun times when you've been working, I mean, really, it was just a lot of late nights, routinely till 2 in the morning, you know. But you were really excited because you knew you were doing something, and as an advertising artist or doing things for books and magazines and things, you do a piece of artwork and send it off, and you never really heard anything. You get a check in the mail, you know, then the next one comes in, send it off, you know. working with a team, like when I did that first game, I'd go in and I'd bring my sketches, and Chris Granter, who did the music and sounds, would come in, John Crutch, the mechanical engineer, the programmers, and we'd be feeding off each other. It's the same in video games, They tell you their ideas they have. Come on, look what we got, and then they'd photograph or have copies made of the artwork. They'd have it on the wall. So you really get into this thing where you don't want to let your team down, and like Carol Serling was worried that we weren't going to do her husband honor, but she didn't know how serious we were about this. We were really giving everything we had. Every game had, back then there was a budget, so every game had toys and things that didn't get into it, that they just said, we can't afford it, I mean, nowadays, the games we build have almost everything in it we want. Still, things do get left out, but so I'm just showing a cabinet art. That's another, at the beginning, blue sky thinking, a lot of little drawings. A rejected pencil there that you can see I drew it first in that non-photo blue so you can draw over it and stuff. The one on the bottom there, sketch number 1, needs work. Pat liked that. He made some changes. So the bottom one, that's the cabinet side. The right side is approved. On the upper right is the back box. And then the lower right there is the cabinet front. All silk screened. And cabinets, we weren't allowed to go hog wild with colors. It's so great. The first one I airbrushed, the first cabinet I airbrushed, I was so thankful. And same way with the play fields. When I could airbrush a play field, I only airbrushed one play field, and that was the first game I did for Stern, which was Sharky's Shootout. Medieval Madness.
So real quick, you said you weren't allowed to go hog wild on the cabinets. Was that for expediency's sake, or was that assuming the focus was on the playfield, the front of the game, or?
That's a really good question, but it had to do with expense. Like I think we could have 4 colors or something like that. So they're more simple, and the cabinets were done quickly. Now a cabinet is treated like a back glass. It's more work than a back glass a lot of times. If you look at the Toy Story 4 CE cabinet, I already had approved cabinets from Pixar and Disney, and the owners of our company, Leonard Abbas, it's a family owned, that owned the majority of our company. He came up with a great idea that we can talk about later on with a cabinet. Next slide. That just made it a lot more work for me. So Medieval Madness, Greg Ferris, those of you that don't know, he was the art director at Williams Valley, and he works for Stern now. But he was a really good art director. He's a good artist, and he's done a lot of his own games long before I ever got into pinball. And so back then we had a lot of teams going, doing games and stuff, and Medieval Madness was his, but he was being dragged away to art direct and help out with other things. So he called me in and said, could you do a back glass in the cabinet for us? So he already had thumbnail sketches, like ideas, concept thinking on those. So that's his drawing in the upper left. And it's, he had, what you see on the right is their hit list. There was a big meeting with the whole team and me just coming in there green. They'd been working on it for probably 6 months. And so they had things they really wanted to see in there. And I remember the peer pressure, just the Greg, this was his baby. And I remember him telling me a lot of times I'd airbrush a glow around highlights and stuff. He says, I don't want to see any of those cheap glows on this artwork. I want the good stuff. He was right. I had to hold back. Next slide.
I love the thought process here. I see the comedy in it because I'm sure we've all seen the game, and you've got things like flaming bowling ball. Seems like a thing that you would have.
There's one on flaming cannonball, like it's been shot out of a what do they call it? Not Dubuchet. That's a liqueur. Trebuchet or something.
Ducks in the moat, and then a vulture. Just
what was the last?
A vulture.
Are they? Is there? Probably. There's a lot of stuff in there, and then I added some things of my own too. I remember painting this one thing, a technical thing. I was using a new surface to get all that detail, and I cut these friskets to put down, and they would not pull up. So it was fastidious work, and it worked in the end. But man, I was never stressed out doing a final painting, but this one drove me crazy. Next slide. Greg also drew this. He had the idea with the, he didn't draw, he did a rough sketch of it, but it's his idea with a, flaming marshmallow going through the banner. Next slide. That's a big piece, cabinet, airbrush cabinet, This is the development of the King, and I go to my family for these kind of things. I had a 16-year-old son, Andy, who's in the lower photo, but he was a senior in college at Southern Illinois, and he just had jaw surgery where they cut your jaw apart and wire it together. So his friend Kurt Larson became the King, and Andy's down there hiding his jaw in the lower right in that photo on the lower left. Kurt went on to be an actor in Hollywood, was on TV series and stuff like that, but I start out with I'm just showing the face of the King, start out with Kurt giving me a great expression, and just transitioning, drawing over, dialing it into how I wanted it on the right. And that's my other son, Charlie, on the left, the two trolls. Here they are. Got to get my pound of flesh out of the kids. Do we have to do this again? They were enthusiastic about it. I can't complain. Next slide. Now we come the transition from painting, which I've told you I dearly loved painting. I loved it. And that's my studio back in Illinois when I was airbrushing. And I ordered really top-end kitchen cabinets, like black walnut cabinets. They were splattered with paint, man. The drawers were full of like gouache, a ton of Dr. Martin dyes, tubes of Badger acrylic and Dr. Martin acrylic. Had a big exhaust system that just took everything right out of the house. My wife had asthma, so it kept a clean environment, but it was messy. It was really a messy process. And when you airbrush a cabinet art, you can imagine it's like painting a car door or something. So you need that. Next slide. And this is my studio in Jonesboro, Tennessee, about 4 hours east of here. That's what it looks like today. My idol there, Alfred Eaton. It's a much cleaner process, and that is, when I first went digital, I had to work on a Wacom tablet. So it's like an Etch-a-Sketch. You're drawing on your lap, and the image is up here. And I was working for IGT out in Reno I did a lot of slot machine artwork, many more games, many more slots than pinball. And they sent me this Wacom Cintiq, which is if you're artists, you know about a pressure-sensitive display where you're no longer drawing in your lap, and you have a cursor that's like your brush, and the harder you press, the more paint, and you can do custom brushes to do hair and stuff, And when I went digital, I cried. I'm not kidding. I cried, because it's like being a violinist, and all of a sudden someone takes the violin and smashes it and says, "We don't want your stinking violin anymore. They don't want my airbrush anymore." And so I was worth a lot more as an airbrush artist too, by the way. Digital kind of evens the playing field a little bit. But I have, I think I'm on my third Wacom Cintiq right now, and I dearly love it. Next slide. Star Trek, I did a lot of games for Stern. I did this with Greg Ferris and Steve Ritchie. And I didn't do the whole game, I just did the back glasses. I think Greg did everything else on these. I could be wrong. You can go to the next slide. This is one of the 3 back glasses. We had a great style guide. It was fun, and I threw a lot of stuff at it and pushed a lot of artwork around to get to the final version, especially when you have to do 3 unique 3 unique back glasses.
So was this an opportunity or a time when you had the complete movie to view, or were you working from static assets at this point?
That's a good question. We had a lot of images. I don't think we had. The movie may have come out, I don't know, because it just takes so long to build a game that the movie may have, by the time I was done, probably it had come out, I wouldn't doubt it, But it was an excellent style guide. We got a lot of digitals, like the background technical stuff, we had good files on that. But working in Photoshop, you can use a lot of tools to ghost images or gradate things out, or, I paint over the figures, even though These have a lot of paint on the figures. I call them, I am painting on them. I call them paint overs. And at IGT in Reno, I never worked there. I've worked out of my house since 1975. You talk about a lucky guy. But when I worked for IGT, I just fell into that role of painting over celebrities. And I remember Sarah Jessica Parker, we were doing Sex in the City, and we were doing like a big 4-bank or 6-bank of slot machines, and they needed a huge sign overhead. So they sent us 35 millimeter slides, and try blowing that up to a 6-foot sign. So Joe Camico, who ran our studio out there, said, "John, I want you to paint all their hair, paint all their faces, but you can take as much time as you want. You can paint them for a month if you want." It was that important, you know. So I made Photoshop brushes just for that, you know. And by then I was comfortable. Painting hair is pretty hard when you first start working digitally. It's pretty hard to do. But once you get into it, you can do anything. Go ahead, next slide. Jersey Jack 2015. Pat had left pinball, and I wanted to quit my job at IGT. And I wanted a guaranteed. I got rid of everything. I was still doing advertising artwork, mostly food product for all kinds of yogurt and drinks and things like that, you know. And I thought, I'm going to retire. The only thing I'm going to keep, the only business I'm going to do anymore is pinball or video games, and that's what I did, you know. So Pat called me, told me he was going to be working with Jersey Jack, and I really trusted him a lot. He'd really, you know, he'd always been square with me and everything, and they cut the deal I was looking for, so that's why I ended up at Jersey Jack Pinball in 2015. And I'm only on game number 4. Dialed in, that's the first game, another disaster game, and it started out as Killer App. And Pat had seen a movie called Sin City, I think. It was like film noir.
So let's be clear, the game wasn't a disaster. We know that. The game was a great game. It was about a disaster theme.
Thanks for correcting me.
Okay.
It was another Pat
Disaster themed game.
showcasing a disaster, yes. He's very comfortable in. But again, it started as Killer App, and he saw it as a film noir, and Pat was always about what I called Crayola colors. The brighter the better. You know, so he came to me with black and white, do black and white art, you know, maybe with a little color. And I think that lasted about 6 months. And then the title was changed. The Killer App was too dark along with the look, you know, so we shifted back to a normal palette, and Dialed In became the working title. And this is Quantum City. This was ultimately rendered by Jean-Paul de Win, and he's our animator, CG guy in the Netherlands. I mean, he still is. We have a new guy named Olaf who's doing the same or similar thing right now. So I had to draw the city. This is very early on, and then he modeled the city. And at Expo, he did a demo on that, demo slides and stuff that were spectacular because I just had to draw it, you know. Next slide. So that's another early drawing of the city, how I wanted it to look. I shouldn't say obviously, but I remember Blade Runner. I watched that a couple times, inspired me to, put images on the buildings and all. I just wanted it to really light up, be strong, and not boring, not the opposite of boring. Next slide. Just getting closer, there it is with the logo on it. Okay, so JP, Jean-Paul, if your name is John and starts with a J, and I'm the oldest guy in the business, everybody else, like there was a Jay-Z for a while, they get the initials. I'm John, that's Jay-Z and JP, So I guess it's seniority, Anyway, so Jean-Paul, JP, modeled the city and spent a lot of time on it. And then I got the modeling back. He asked, because I needed to show it on the playfield and on the cabinet sides. So he gave me a fully modeled city from those angles, and I painted over it to give it that look and added all the mayhem in the background. Next slide.
Now, when you say fully modeled, or digitally modeled?
Digitally modeled, yeah, 3D, where you could turn it and do any angle you want. Play fields, we go through a ton of them because we can. And the games, there's more toys on them. I work a year on a play field or something, maybe longer. And they're all, each version is presented. So we're on to Willy Wonka now. And over on the left, you see a white wood. And one thing I like to do is at the very beginning, I'm working on digitally, don't forget. So I'll take that CAD drawing and I do all my work over the top of the CAD drawing. I photographed a sheet of plywood a long time ago, and I just use that in Photoshop. I put it behind it, so it just makes me feel like it's pinball now. I have a sheet of plywood to work on. And then I add, as soon as I can, I start adding physical things. So the middle image, the one in the middle, all those playfield parts are painted by me. They're created just so I can look at the playfield. They didn't exist yet. So I can look at the playfield, see where the lanes are, see where I need to. One of the artist's main job, there's two things that I was told early on about pinball. On the back glass, or just the art in general, will draw a player to the game. But the gameplay keeps the player there. That's important. So you gotta catch their eye. And that continues to this day. And what was the second thing about the play? I was going to come up with a second thing about the playfield, but I'll think of it later and toss it in there. Go ahead. Gene Wilder, I'm just going to mention here that for Willy Wonka, that film was made in '68, I think. And the style guide, the images they sent us were awful. They were awful. And it was Warner Brothers at the beginning. They were acquired or partnered with someone else in the middle of the project. And I was told, you can't paint on any of these characters. And you can't take an Oompa Loompa that's all blurry and put them on the side of a cabinet or something. It just looked like a joke, So I did this dance. We always have someone you're submitting work to with a film company or whatever. And I went through this dance with that person out there, and we got a good relationship going, and we can go to some more slides. I did have a really good image of Gene Wilder. I'll just say, here's the playfield art on the left. I'm doing my normal thing where I'm knocking holes out of there to help see. And the playfield on the right has not the rails, but the wire ramps, plastic parts. It's all artwork so when I'm working on it, I can see it. But the artwork's basically done there with my phony stuff on top of it. Next slide. Okay, getting back to the style guide that was terrible. The Oompa Loompas were the worst because they usually in the movie, they were in the background usually. So I started from scratch with them and just pretended it was the old days, and just started drawing Oompa Loompas. And there were like 5 or 6 of them. After I developed them, you can go to the next slide. This is just an example that I sent Warner Brothers of how I started the art and how it ended up on the right. And along the way, and you'll get to see it more in the next slides, I realized I can't call it, I'm going to paint over these. I couldn't say that anymore, because I was getting pushback. So I just changed my description to they're adjusted. I adjusted the images, and everything was fine. The Gene Wilder figure that's the only good high-res image we had. And to make that
And that was from 1968.
Say what?
That image was from 1968.
68.
68.
Yes. Well, yes, but they'd had it retouched or something. I don't know if they did or not. It was a really good image. That's the only good one we had. And even to get that, I wanted to have him with his arm out, something to direct the player up into the game. So I combined a couple photos and then painted over it. And I photographed my own hand in that image over on the right. I'm missing a finger, so I have to be careful what hand I model with, Just shot it with an iPhone on my patio and then painted over the whole thing to give it uniformity. Next slide. Okay, here's the Oompa Loompas were really the worst. So again, they didn't see the sketches. They never saw the sketches. And I really loved the guy on the upper right. I don't remember his name, but then I realized we only had permission to use 2. So Rusty Goth, was that his name? is the guy on the bottom there that I'm showing here. There were two of them and made the switch. And you can kind of see the process here. Then the next slide. They're not, the one on the right on the bottom is finished. The one on the left is finished. And then the one in the middle is kind of a transition at the beginning of painting. You know, I'm painting right over the pencil sketch in Photoshop. Next slide. So this is, I think this is Rusty Goth, or Goff. So if that's photo reference, I keep the photo reference all around me. I don't know why I have the rejected guy in the upper right, but I guess I'd already painted him and I liked it, so I wanted to use that to grab sample color from and stuff like that. And I liked his hair. And that's my body, by the way, on the lower right. Next slide, whatever it takes. You got to get it done, you know. Next slide. And I'm a cheap model, you know. Watching the movie, just finding I call them design devices, things you can use to frame artwork and such, and on plastics or around an insert. I developed that and drawing it. I draw it with a pencil. I call it a pencil brush in Photoshop. Sometimes I'll do it on a tablet and scan it, whatever, you know, and then paint it on the right. Next slide. I wanted the player to really feel like he's in that village where Wonka had his factory and everything. So I wanted to be able to show the village without that gate and everything. So I took several images, patched them together, and ended up just basically painting those buildings over again. But to the point where I painted shingles for that roof. I remember painting like a couple rows of shingles and then cloning them. Next slide. I want you all to get to bed early tonight. This is like inside the factory, and I used it as a background piece for the cabinet. And I think it may have been on a side blade a little bit, but it's almost all painted. The whole thing is just had to be done by hand. Like his little boat over there on the right, same thing. It's a magical little place, but in the movie you never see the whole thing at once. You know, you see parts of it and you just have to kind of put it together in your brain, how it might have been. Next slide. So this is Toy Story 4, the game. There's two of them on the floor. And that's the last game I've completed. Like I said, I'm working on a new one. And so starting with watching the movie, seeing things I like, trying to solve problems, the beginning of a lot of artwork. and this, by the way, this was a great style guide we worked directly with Disney, and then Disney would submit things to Pixar. So first I have to like it, then Pat Lawler had to like it. Then the higher ups at our company at Jersey Jack had to like it. Then Disney had to like it. Then Pixar had to like it. And I have to tell you, I have a son who works for an animation studio. And the Disney guys, they all just look like my son. They were easy to work with. They were funnier. They were just so funny. You know, you show up in a meeting, their studios look like my kid's office, you know, out in Vancouver. They're really easy to work with. And by the way, they loved the fact we were doing a pinball machine. They get so excited, you know. It's great because you don't, like with Willy Wonka, it was a war, you know, all the time. But with these guys, it went really well. 3 cabinets for Toy Story. I wish I would have shown these bigger because this is the point I wanted to make about the CE cabinet on the bottom. I had 3 cabinets approved by everybody. And Leonard Abbas and, well, the family that, you know, owns the majority of it. And I don't even know how this works, but I think they own almost all of us. But, you know, they encourage us. They're easy to work with. But Leonard had this idea. If you've seen Toy Story 4, part of it takes place in an antique store in Grand Basin in California. I think it's up in the Sierras somewhere. But at one point in the antique store, the characters are inside a pinball machine. So Leonard said, after everything's been approved, he said, why don't you make it so that we can see inside our cabinet and you can see what's going on inside the pinball machine? And my first thought, I thought, that is a great idea, but they'll never buy it. You know, we can't do that, you know, because if they're in there, in order to get them, you know, they're little characters inside there, you know. So you have this big cabinet side, and you have like some of the characters are teeny tiny, you know. They'll never buy it, you know. But I said, I love it. I'll make a pitch for it, you know. And I'll be darned if they just went crazy over it out of Disney and Pixar. So I said, well, we need, because it's a cabinet, it's got to be big. So I needed super high res images. So we had they sent us an indexed version of the movie, and I could call out specific frames that I needed super high res on. And I still didn't get what I asked for, but it was really close. And to the point where I had to highlight an area on, you know, so they could visually see which area I needed high res. They were tied up doing their next film, and I had to wait a month to get them. Next slide. Just some working things. This is a photograph of a prototype of the Star Adventure shot, which, you know, is replicating a scene from the movie where Duke Kaboom, the Canadian motorcyclist, goes flying through that Star Adventure's opening there and right across the moon in slow motion. And we wanted to replicate that on the playfield back there. So that's an early version of it. Go ahead, next slide. Thank you, Brent. The playfield, I've already told you enough about playfields. There's the playfield. I will say this. Okay, now that's it. Good. This is between November 5th, 2020 and December 14th, 2020. Those are all art changes in that period of time. Sometimes they're little, sometimes they're big, sometimes just a post moves or something, you know, but you're constantly keeping the playfield up to date. You can't get behind, or you lose it, you know, you have to stay current. Next slide.
Are you finding, John, in the digital era that the playfield change requests come more often because they're easier?
Yeah, they do.
Or is this like a circular type of a conversation where they realize it's easier, so they make it come more often?
It is easier to change. It's a lot easier than, you know, and plus the time, we have more time. Back in the day, I think the game designers, engineers, everybody had to have a finished game in a year, and I had 6 months to do the artwork. They go on longer. We have more stuff in there. There's more people involved. The price has gone up. You know, clients, I shouldn't say clients, but customers are more demanding, you know. That's just me talking, by the way. So, you know, if you can, plus you can see it. Back in the old days, like I told you, I was sending in faxes for approval, you know. Now, all along, the playfield looks almost finished artwork, you know, so people see things and come up with ideas to add. And, you know, and I have nothing to do with this, but getting the ball to, you guys know more about this than me if you're pinball players, but getting the ball to really flow in the game, and its physics, and I mean, when you're shooting a good game, it just seems to happen like magic, you know, and I take it for granted sometimes. This is blue sky thinking. Again, just watching them. I probably did this like 3/4 into the movie because I just needed more stuff, you know, so I'd watch and look, stop the frames, you know, look at something, draw it, you know, and that's what that's all about. Go ahead. These are drawings for the topper, and we went through a number of toppers. This is one place we were almost done with everything, and Disney really wanted the topper to be special, and we did too. It only goes on the CE. So this one was pitched with one wheel with Duke Kaboom that spins in an opening in the clouds up there. It's layered plex. I think there's 4 layers. And we ended up, at one point we had 3 wheels spinning, as I recall. And the foreground changed. At one point it was just a carnival, which is how it ended up really. As I recall, Disney and Pixar, they didn't like us repeating things. So they saw those characters up there and they said, they're right on the back glass, you know, get rid of them. You don't need them up there. Same with our logo. One logo on the game. Everybody, us, we put our logo on the back box, on the playfield, on the cabinets, you know. Disney didn't want any of that repetition. They wanted it to look really fresh, and it was refreshing to see that. So that's kind of why we got rid of the characters, and you basically just see the basic carnival grounds, and I don't have anything here on it. And by the way, I've never seen, I was up at Expo, and they had the CE game with that top, with the new topper on it, with fireworks, a fiber optic version of fireworks, and I never saw it work. I haven't seen it all lit up and working the way it should, but it should be pretty, it's got to be spectacular. You know? I think we're coming to the end. I hope so. Side blades, man, when I found out I had to do side blades, it's like, what? You know, because man, here we are, like another long, big, giant piece of artwork, you know, and it's always at the end, and you think, oh, John, you forgot the side blades. You know, we need them next week. You know, I go, they're like 40 inches long or something, you know. And I got hammered for a little bit by critics on my Willy Wonka side blades. They weren't high, they didn't feel they were high res enough. But people are zooming in on those images, you know, and looking at them really close and on the computer. And the player is standing 3 feet away or something. So I'd rather put the player in the village, in the town, and use that stuff and paint over and get as tight as I can. So to do this, it's basically a Photoshop project. There is a lot of painting in there, but it's mostly just grabbing images, because there was no image like this in the style guide. You had to combine maybe like a dozen images and then patch them together and paint and stuff to make it flow. The middle one was rejected because it was a dark side blade kind of darkens the play field, and that's bad. And plus the scale, the one on the top, I did that first. The left side blade was done first. It was approved by everybody. Then I did the right, and it was rejected for those reasons. Too dark, and the artwork is at the wrong scale. So then worked on that one on the bottom. So the upper one is more the carnival. The bottom is more the town of Grand Basin with the antique, some of the stores behind it, and a few rides. We got to be near the end here, right? Yeah, we're near the end. I'm just showing some pinball artwork here for if you have any questions. I think the next 3 or 4 are just miscellaneous.
So is this a good time, John, to maybe throw it to the audience if anyone has any questions of anything we've covered? Or
So you mentioned royalties earlier, and it made me wonder, like there's like this creation of these digital pinball machines, and there's digital digital pinball games on like the Nintendo Switch and Steam and stuff like that. Do you get residual checks from those things as well?
I would take a lawyer to do that, and I haven't got anything on that. Like when they redid, even they're rebuilding or have rebuilt Medieval Madness. At least I think so. I haven't seen one yet, but I might go. I guess I could go for that. I don't know. I'm not at the top of my game with that stuff. How about other ones? Any questions?
What was the record company you talked about at the beginning? The record company?
what was the record company you talked about at the beginning that you
wanted to go work for?
That you wanted to go work for? That I believe at the beginning you mentioned that you had done some album covers.
Yeah, they had 3 artists. What was the company? So it was in Chicago.
It was a lot of companies. I was a freelance illustrator. I had reps in Chicago, New York, and one on the West Coast. And so I'm not kidding. I was busy. I didn't have time to do pinball, but I fell in love with pinball fast. And it was that teamwork thing that did it for me. When you're a freelance illustrator working out of your house, it's your dream, and then one day you realize I never see anybody. I'm not joking. You get lonely. Like 6 dogs, a couple of kids and stuff, but it was just really nice to work with other people. But I did a lot of McDonald's. Leo Burnett, J. Walter Thompson. In New York, I did a lot of liquor ads and a lot of book covers, a lot of magazine work. You name it, just about any kind of artwork, It was fun.
So any other questions for John? John, I'd like to thank you for spending this time with us. I mean, this is some unbelievable information, and it's the body of work here is amazing. Personally, as I have looked further, worked more with pinball machines, and look past the mechanics, the art really jumps out at me. And again, this is an amazing conversation to have. For me personally, and I'm sure for a lot of the folks in the audience here, it brings a new understanding of the game from an angle that a lot of us haven't considered.
It's good to hear. It's refreshing, you know. We're serious about what we do, you know. So it's nice to know it really is good to be appreciated and remembered. I mean, we really thought our old games would all be in the landfill by now. We really believed that, you know, when pinball crashed. And so it's been like just a great revival, and hope it keeps going, you know.
And I'm sure it will with you and a lot of folks at Jersey Jack and the like, continuing to produce awesome games with awesome play fields and awesome shots and even better artwork.
Wow. Thank you, Brent. It's been a pleasure to be here.
So a round of applause for John Youssi.
Thank you. Thank you.